Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm going to do a drawing of a Harry Potter character. This is Alan Rickman as Severus Snape, and it's mostly going to be done in charcoal, but I'm going to talk about my materials a little bit later. This was actually the second attempt. I had to throw the first one away. It was based on a slightly different reference photo. I don't really know why this one didn't work, but I just couldn't get the facial features to look right. And this was the second one. This one went a bit more smoothly, and they're both kind of similar. Both of the references, they're kind of an upshot with him turning slightly to one side. But like I said, I liked the second one a bit better. Of course, I made some changes to it, both to the background and the face, but this one went a little bit better. Now I should say a few words about my materials. I'm mostly going to be using Kohinoor pencils, Kohinoor Gioconda charcoal pencils. I'm going to be using a soft charcoal pencil, Kohinoor Gioconda extra charcoal. And the harder pencils that I'm going to use for much of the shading process and the details are Kohinoor Gioconda silky black pencils, which are, I think, also a kind of charcoal pencils, but they also have some binders and other materials in them, so they kind of feel more like colored pencils rather than charcoal pencils. They're a little bit harder, and it's easier to sharpen them and to achieve more precision and cleaner details with them. In addition to that, I'm also going to use vine charcoal and charcoal powder, and of course a variety of blending and erasing tools, which I'm going to talk about during the drawing process. And now one of the things that I like to do is I like to define these darkest areas first when I can, when I'm doing these portraits, because that really helps me navigate through the rest of the portrait a lot more easily. Because when I have those darker bits in place, it helps me establish the contrasts more easily. It helps me determine how much value I need in other parts of the face. So that's just something I like to do, and here I started by drawing that darker area to the left of the forehead and the left of the face, because that part of his hair in between that left side of the face and the hair is really dark because it's a shadow area, and plus of course his hair is pretty dark, but not all parts of that hair are going to be pitch black. Some of them are going to be lighter than others. And his hair is kind of all over the place, with a lot of these flyaway hairs and flyaway segments of hair. So I'm trying to capture that random look of his hair, and I'm also doing a bit of blending with a brush, as you can see, so that the hair would appear to have a little more volume, because I can't draw every single hair. Now when I draw these details around the eye, I have to be a little bit more careful, and like I said, for these parts I like to use that harder black pencil. And the technique that I'm going to use for most of the shading process, especially when I can't afford to rush, is a tapered stroke, just cross-hatching, a combination of cross-hatching and a tapered stroke. That'll allow me to control the amount of value in different parts of the face. Of course, I'm not always going to use that technique, but it's usually a good idea. It's usually a good approach when you're doing portraits, because it really helps you build up the value gradually, so that you can get the proportions and the shape of the face, rather the topography of the face to look right. Now as for the proportions, which I mentioned, one of the quickest ways to get a nice quick sketch is to use a tracing method. I often like to use a combination of tracing and freehand. That's one of my favorite methods. But I'm going to talk about that in a separate video one day. Right now I'm doing this one, and the eyebrows here are a little bit tricky. And the reason why I think they're tricky is because he has kind of thick, slightly bushy eyebrows, but at the same time, because the eyebrow area is kind of prominent, it's casting a bit of shadow under it, so it's a little bit difficult to determine where the shadow ends and the hair begins. But the best way to treat that is to squint your eyes or zoom out a little bit from your reference photo and just look at how large the dark area is supposed to be. And once you put those larger darker areas in place, things get a lot easier. So here I'm going to move on to the other eye. I zoomed in a little bit and slowed down the footage a little bit so that you can see that as well. A lot of these videos are a combination of real-time and time-lapse. I like to show you at least some parts of the drawing process in real time. But if you want to see longer videos, full-length videos, you should check out my Patreon, of course. Because there you can find many full-length videos with detailed explanations, and you can observe the drawing process in real time and draw along. Now, here on YouTube, I also like to post fairly long videos. Most of them are at least a half an hour, and I have plenty of portraits. I haven't done many Harry Potter drawings. I think the only one I've done was actually another drawing of Professor Snape. I did a drawing of this character at least 2 times before, I think, and he's one of the favorite characters. I'm not particularly keen on the Harry Potter books or movies. As you know, I'm more of a Tolkien fan myself. But to each his own. Sometimes I like to draw other things as well. So there are some small highlights in the eye, some catch lights in the eye, but they're kind of subdued because of all the shadow. And I'm also adding a bit more value to the eyeball. Now, because this needs to have a little bit of value, but I can't go over it with too much value, I'm just going to use a graphite pencil. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and use graphite in addition to these charcoal pencils, because I want a lighter area, but an area that'll still have some value. And I sometimes used graphite for the whites of the eye because I don't want to leave them completely white, but I want to leave them significantly lighter than the rest of the face, the rest of the skin around the eye. So another tricky bit here, shading around the eye, shading the eye socket area, because all the details in the eye won't help you much if you fail to shade the eye socket properly, if you fail to give it enough value in comparison to the rest of the face, and of course if you fail to convey the shape of that eye socket area to the viewer, because that's one of the most important areas for capturing lightness. And so is the nose, by the way. And I would say that Professor Snape has a fairly large nose, and maybe it doesn't seem that way because of this angle, but maybe it does. His nostrils look large enough, that's for sure, from this angle. So you can see how much work I'm doing with this harder pencil. I'm only going to be using the soft charcoal pencil for the larger areas. Now the forehead is a lot lighter than the rest of the face. In most cases, when you think about light source, in most cases the light source is coming from above. And that's especially the case if you're drawing landscapes and wildlife and things like that, because the light source is usually coming from above, from the sky, from the sun. But when you're drawing portraits, of people indoors, you can have a variety of directions that the light source can come from. Sometimes you can have multiple light sources. Sometimes the light source can be coming from below, and that can make it a little bit tricky to understand the shape of the face. Here we have a strong contrast between the light side and the shadow side, and the light source is coming from above and more from the left, which means that the lower side and the right side are going to be quite a bit darker. So I'm going to try to stay consistent with that and to shade the face in that manner, and then hopefully I will get something that looks like a three-dimensional realistic looking face. As for the hair, there are a couple of ways you can approach this. You can use a harder pencil to draw these individual lines. You can use a combination of tapered stroke and a regular stroke to get what you want, and you can try to achieve seamless transitions, and that way you can give their hair a little bit of texture, and then use blending tools on top of that. But another thing that you can do is just cover the whole thing with charcoal and then pull some highlights using a pencil eraser. I opted for the former approach. I used a harder pencil and started adding some lines, but I didn't do all of the hair on the right. I just added enough of the value to the hair on the right to be able to gauge how much value I need on the face. So sometimes I just put down a bit of value in a part of the portrait just for some kind of a reference, so that I can understand how much darker I need to go in that part of the face or in that part of the portrait. By the way, I find Alan Rickman, I find his face a little bit difficult to draw. So the first couple of times that I did his portrait, it went pretty well. I was pretty happy with the way the drawings came out. But the one that I tried to do the other day, based on the first reference photo, didn't go so well. So there's just and I've noticed that before when I was doing his drawings. There's something a little bit confusing about the shape of that nose and forehead area, as well as the shape of the mouth. So this time I decided to use those harder pencils a little bit more, and to shade a bit more patiently and a bit more gradually, because I really wanted to take my time and to understand the shapes that I see, so that I wouldn't find myself in a situation where something is off and I just can't identify what it is. And that happens sometimes when you draw. The good idea, the best idea probably in that situation is to leave the portrait and maybe go back to it a week later, or even a couple of weeks later. But sometimes you can't afford to do that. You have to move on. You have to get the job done. So I decided to cut my losses and start a new one. And that's always kind of difficult to do. If you're an artist and you ever had to start over, that's very, very annoying. It feels kind of exhausting when you have to do the same thing all over again. But I found that as disappointing as having to throw away a piece that you were working on is, as disappointing as that is, it's always better to start a new one right away, because that gives you a new sense of purpose, and it gives you a little more confidence when you feel that you have a new project underway, and this one is actually starting to work a little bit better. There's a lot of dark areas here around the collar. because that's a shadow area in between the hair, in between the clothes and the face. So obviously I'm using a bit more pressure with my colored pencils in that area, or with my with those harder pencils, those black pencils. I often refer to them as colored pencils because they feel like a black colored pencil. In the way they are applied and the way they feel when you put them down on the paper, they are not that dissimilar from, let's say, Faber-Castell black colored pencils. So they are more similar to those than they are to Kohinoor charcoal pencils. But I do believe they have some kind of charcoal or carbon in them, which makes them less reflective and darker. So I'm shading the area around the mouth, or rather under the lower lip, and trying to get the overall shape of the mouth to look as it's supposed to. One of the things that you often notice when I'm doing portraits is how I almost like to make a circle as I shade the face. I usually start on the left and then circle my way to the other eye, to the eye on the right. Here I kind of did both of the eyes first, and now I'm shading the right side of the face, which is supposed to be a little bit darker. But I also need to try to define his prominent cheekbones, and in order for them to appear the way they should, I need to have a sufficient range of value so that that lighter part, or that protruded part of the face, would really stick out. So you need to shade the sides with a lot more value. And of course the area in between the chin, in between the jaw and the collar, and in between the right side of the face and the hair is going to be a little bit darker because of the shadow. And one of the things that's helping me a lot, not just with the amount of value, but also with the smoothness of texture, are the brushes. They help me smooth things out, but they also help me add a bit of value to some areas without me having to shade everything thoroughly. Sometimes I can just make an area a little bit darker just by going over it a few more times with a brush. Now here I decided to work a little bit more both on the shading and the texture, because sometimes when I shade a little bit more quickly, I create a lot of that rough, ugly texture, which can be interesting because it can help you imitate the appearance of the skin, especially if you're drawing a character with a rough skin. But at the same time, it does pay off to soften some of that texture so that the lines are not too distracting, so that those marks that you create with your pencil are not too distracting to the viewer. So the key thing, of course, is to capture the volume and the shape and the depth, for which you need a range of value. But at the same time, you mustn't just hack with your pencil, creating an ugly texture and a bunch of visible lines and marks, because a lot of the viewers won't really be happy with that. They want to see maybe a more realistic looking drawing where you can't see all of those marks. So I do my best to hide those or soften them with a brush or maybe even a Q-tip. And you'll see once I finish shading this, the face here, I'm going to be moving on to the body and the clothes, and that's going to be a much shorter part of much easier part of the process. Now I'm using a pencil eraser to pull some of the highlights on the face, to draw some of the lighter areas on the face. This is a very important part of the shading process, and an important part of capturing the likeness of the character, because it helps you kind of emphasize the topography of the face. by showing which parts of that face are lighter, which part of them are protruding, which parts of them, which part of that face are closer to the light source. And when you use a pencil eraser to draw the highlights, that really helps you increase the range of value. I'm gonna have a background, of course. For the background, I'm gonna create a simple, fairly simple dark background with the main character kind of popping in contrast, popping out of the paper in contrast, popping out of that dark background. And I'm going to try to create a sufficient amount of contrast, but in some parts of the portrait I'm going to blur things a little bit and create a little bit less contrast. So I want the face and the area around the face to have a lot of contrast, and I want the head and the face to pop out. But the rest of it, I'm gonna make everything a little bit less defined. So it's going to be a combination of some more detailed, well-defined parts and more abstract and less defined parts on this portrait. In addition to the vine charcoal, I also put down some charcoal powder. I created the charcoal powder by sharpening one of my charcoal pencils, and this is of course charcoal powder made from sharpening a compressed charcoal pencil, or you can also use a compressed charcoal stick. This makes it a bit darker, and it makes it stick to the surface of the paper a little bit more. And the reason why I like to use my finger is because those parts of the background which I cover in this manner are going to be a little bit darker. The parts which I cover with a brush are going to appear a little bit lighter, because your finger, because of its texture and the natural oils, it tends to push the charcoal harder into the grain of the paper, and tends to make things a bit darker than you would be able to make them with other blending tools. And the reason why I also use vine charcoal in addition to this is because vine charcoal is so easily moved, and it's also lighter, and it helps you create those transitions and gradients. And the charcoal powder in combination with vine charcoal, this helps me create some almost painterly effects. As you can see with the background, it almost looks like a painting, and I'm going to leave it like that. I'm not going to try to smooth everything out. I want a little bit of variation and a bit of randomness in the background, but I'm not going to put any details in there. So on this right side of the hair, I'm actually trying to break up that hair into different segments and define them individually by drawing some darker areas in between them. So when you're drawing hair, you can't just draw a whole bunch of hair, because you can't draw every single hair. And of course the hair consists of different shapes, different segments, and you want to define relationships between those segments by making some portions of that hair a little bit darker and others are a little bit lighter. So I'm going to do most of the work here with this harder pencil, and just trying to maintain that contrast between those darker bits and the lighter bits. If the texture looks a little bit ugly right now, I can smooth it out using a pencil eraser, using a brush rather. Sorry about that. I'm going to be using brushes a lot, and brushes do blend these pencils pretty well. I find that flat bristle brushes, especially if they're harder brushes with a crop tip, they will blend almost anything, and they will blend things very, very smoothly. And that's going to be the case here with this hair. So another thing that the brush does, it kind of gives the hair a bit more volume, because you can't draw every single hair when you use a brush, it starts to fill in those white spaces in between and makes everything a bit darker and also a bit fuller in terms of volume. And that's what I want to achieve when I'm trying to draw a realistic looking hair. I'm just going back in and trying to define some of the smaller bits on the face. Sometimes when you do the hair and a bit of the background, sometimes you end up noticing certain things on the face which you want to correct. But just a few touches on the hair here, and I'm going to be moving on with the rest of the background. So I draw a whole bunch of these flyaway hairs on the right, just like I did on the left. And they kind of vary both in terms of their direction and the size and the length. And here I'm just going to move on to the background. And the first thing that I'm going to do is use a bit of vine charcoal. Once again, the reason why, and I'm also going to use charcoal powder again. The reason why I use vine charcoal first is because I like the ability to move it around. I like that it doesn't stick to the paper and you can do all sorts of things with it. And it just helps me create some interesting looking effects. But in order to be able to produce those effects, I suppose you need to practice a little bit, because the first time you try it, it will probably seem ugly to you, but once you practice with the different types of materials, you just get to know them a little bit better, and you get to understand what you can or cannot do with them. So I'm using a large brush here for blending these larger areas and making things smoother, making these gradients a bit smoother, and at the same time creating some sort of transition between those darker areas and lighter areas, making sure that I retain that contrast between the background and the main subject. Finally, I'm going to move on to the rest of the body and the robe. And this presumably will be the easy part of this drawing process. So I'm just going to make some suggestions of folds here on his robe, making some indications of darker areas. And then I'm going to kind of fade the lower part of the robe into the dark area below. So you know how I often talk about drawing vignettes, and I love drawing vignettes when I do portraits, because it really helps you with the composition, and it helps you focus on the things that you want to focus on, rather than having to waste time drawing irrelevant details like different details on the clothes and patterns on clothes. So here, just by using a vignetting technique, you can focus on the face and kind of simplify the clothes. Here you can do that as well, but just another thing that I can add is a bit more value at the bottom, where it will end up hopefully with my character popping out to the paper and appearing to have a more three-dimensional appearance, I suppose. I'm just going to cover this large area carelessly using a combination of soft charcoal and vine charcoal. I'm just going to cover everything and blend that a bit more quickly. I guess you could say I felt like I was in a little bit of hurry at this point, but you know, that's understandable. You will often feel like you've spent most of your energy on the portrait itself, and then when it comes to drawing the clothes and maybe some details on the background, you just don't have much energy for it left, and you just want to simplify things, which is what I often do with these vignettes. And like I said, you can achieve a vignette on a white piece of paper where you fade the portrait towards the edge, or you can do it here on a darker piece of paper simply by fading the main subject into the blackness of the paper. So I'm just putting down some of the finishing touches with a pencil eraser, drawing some of these highlights around the collar, because I want some of these things to stand out a bit more. And once I finish that, I'm just gonna wrap things up. Just a few more touches to my portrait, and it's almost done. I'm going to put my signature in the lower left corner. I'm going to erase it using a pencil eraser, maybe fix it a little bit, but it's almost done. Now I'm just going to remove the tapes that are securing the paper, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed the drawing process. Don't forget to check out my other videos. I have plenty of those, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye for now.